Do manual Porsches keep their value better than automatic ones? That's a question that I get asked almost on a daily basis. But when you think about it, not such a strange question. There are many occasions in which a manual might be preferred over an automatic, hereby resulting in a higher demand and consequently a price trend that differs from its automatic counterpart. We can, for example, hypothesize that manual GT cars hold their value better. These cars are frequently bought by the real drivers who want maximum engagement when they take their car out for a spin. But also other situations come to mind. Think about the older models that came with the Tiptronic. While that system was not bad for its time, it falls short of the modern PDKs. Personally, I would always choose a manual over a Tiptronic, but not per definition over a PDK. In this video, we'll evaluate the price trends of several Porsche models and investigate if the price trends for the manuals are stronger than for the automatics. But before we dive into the data, it's important that we discuss a few points. You see, while it may sound easy in theory, it's quite difficult in practice to draw conclusions based on the price trends only. Manuals are often quite rare, and this hinders the interpretation of the price trends. Think for example about a graph where manual prices are trending up and automatics are flat. How do we know that the upward price trend in the manual market can be attributed to the fact that the cars have a manual transmission? Perhaps the median mileage has been decreasing, the cars have more often rare colors or a high spec level like ceramic brakes. Second, even if we would have two groups of identical cars with exception of their transmission type, it would still be difficult to evaluate if the difference in price trend is really there or that it's just a result of chance. There are several statistical methods that we can use to solve both of these issues, but they require more data than that we have in order to give reliable results. So instead of diving into all sorts of difficult techniques, we're going to use the good old eyeballing approach. That is, if it looks like the manual trend is deviating from the automatic trend and there are no obvious reasons for it, like the difference in the mileage development, we're going to conclude that it's likely that the trend for the manual is stronger. We're, however, only going to look at the Boxster, Caymans and 911s after 1999. These are the only cars for which I have data. And out of this group, we're only going to have a look at the markets that have sufficient supply. It's simply pointless to have a look at a price trend that's based on 5 cars only. Now before we look into the data, I would like to remind you that you can still skip Masterworks waitlist and invest in blue chip art by using the link in the video description. And with that we dive into the pricing data. We start with the GT models. Over here we have the price trend for the 9912 GT3 non-touring models. In orange we have the manuals and in blue the PDKs. Looking at these two price trends, we can only conclude that they move in sync. Compared to the market of last April, manuals lost 8.5% and automatics 8.9%. The small difference between the two numbers is probably just the result of chance. Looking at the increase rate, we can see that manuals went up by 28.4% between January 2020 and April 2022, and that this is 25.1% for the automatics. Again, given the time period, I think that this difference is more likely to result from chance or a slight difference in the underlying mileage development. The median mileage increased quicker in the automatic market and this of course reduces the price. So what about the 992 GT3? Over here we have again in orange the manuals and in blue the PDKs. Last year the manuals lost 15.2% and the automatics 14.2%. So again, the numbers are very similar and the difference could be the result of chance. Now based on the results that we just saw, there seems to be almost no difference between the automatic and the manuals in the GT markets, at least in the ones that have sufficient supply. But what about these older cars? Personally, I think that a 996 Carrera with a manual transmission is much more desirable than one with a Tiptronic. Over here we have the price trend for the 996.1 Carreras. In orange we have again the manuals and in blue the automatics. You can see that the trends are quite volatile as the markets are relatively small. Yet, if we focus on the long-term trends, we can see that the difference is not so large. Between January 2020 and November 2022, manuals increased by 43.3% and automatics by 47.3%. And given the volatility, I would not focus too much on this difference of 4 percentage points. Now if we switch to the 997.1, so the last 911 model before the PDK, we can see that there are some differences. In red and orange, we have the manual and automatic S models, and in green and blue, the manual and automatic base models, and only the rear-wheel driven cars are included. Now looking at the S models, we can see that the manuals increased much more than the automatics, but it would be false to draw this conclusion. The difference results from the mileage development. In April 2020, the automatics and manuals both had a median mileage of roughly 55,000 miles, yet the median mileage for the manuals decreased over time, whereas it increased for the automatics. In November 2022, manuals had a median mileage of 41,000 miles and automatics of 61,000 miles. So we might assume that the quality of the cars increased significantly in the manual market and that this effect caused prices to increase more than in the automatic market. The price trends for the base model do then also give a much better picture of what happened. Automatics increased by 39.7% and manuals by 37.8%. In other words, there's no difference. And the story is the same in the Boxster market. Over here we have the manuals and automatics in the 987.1 base Boxster market. The price trends are again very similar. During the last 2 years, the manuals increased slightly more. But when you look deeper into the data, you'll find that this mainly results from changes in the market composition. Switching to the complete 987 Cayman market, we can see that also here there isn't a significant difference between the manuals and automatics. Automatics lost a bit more between August and November of last year, but this results from a change in the mileage. So we covered now quite many market segments and quite many graphs. I hope you're still with me. But all of these graphs basically showed us that there is no significant difference between the manuals and the automatics. And we can see the same in the more modern 911, Boxster and Cayman markets. But instead of going through all of them just to arrive at the same conclusion, I will put them on the screen briefly so you can pause at the price trend you're most interested in. The same conclusion namely applies to the 991.1 Carrera 2 base and S market, the 991.2 Carrera 2 base and S market, the 992 Carrera 2 base and S market, the 981 Cayman base market, the 718 Cayman market, the 718 Boxster market, and the 981 Boxster market. But now then, there are also market segments in which we can see a significant difference between the automatic and the manuals. And if you are a true Porsche aficionado, you probably won't be surprised to find out that these are the market segments for the older turbo models. Over here we have the 996 turbo market split by the manuals and automatics. The manuals increased by 64% and the automatics by 31%. That's a crazy difference. While there are some fluctuations in the mileages over time, I think it's fair to call this a real difference. If we namely do a deep dive into this market, we can see that it are low mileage cars that are mainly responsible for the price divergence. Over here we can see the price development for the automatics and manuals split by mileage bucket. In other words, it shows the value development for cars with roughly the same mileage. It might look like a big bunch of spaghetti, but don't worry, I only want to discuss the top two lines. These represent the price development in the manual turbo market for cars between 0 and 26,000 miles and between 26 and 40,000 miles. You can clearly see that this is the segment that pushed prices up in the manual turbo market. Cars with more than 40,000 miles saw a much smaller decrease. If we transition to the 997.1 turbo market, we can see something similar. Prices increased by 14.5% in the automatic market and by 37.6% in the manual market. You can see that there's a strong drop in the beginning of last year, but this results from a change in mileage. Over the last 3 years, the manuals clearly increased more. If we again look at the price development per mileage bucket, we can see that it are mainly the low mileage cars that pushed prices up in the manual market, so the cars with less than 35,000 miles, and these price dynamics are very similar to the 996 turbo market. And with that, it's time to bring everything together and conclude. If you're wondering if you should buy a manual because it will hold its value better, the short answer is, usually you shouldn't. We saw that manuals tend to be a bit more expensive, but that prices develop in the same way as in the automatic market. So if you're shopping in a high supply market, just buy what you prefer. That's usually a good guideline. It's only when we switched our focus to older, more niche segments that we saw some differences. In the 996 and 997.1 turbo markets, we clearly saw that low mileage manuals soared. Undoubtedly, they achieved the status of collectibles. Of course, there might be other niche market segments to which this does apply, but without sufficient supply, it's difficult to evaluate the price trends. Now, even though that the manuals tend to follow the same price trends as their automatic counterparts, there might be other advantages to the manual market that we simply couldn't capture with the data that we have. For example, we only looked at the asking prices, but it could be so that the difference between the asking and selling price is lower for the manuals than for the automatics. We simply cannot know. Second, it could also be so that manuals sell quicker than automatics, but also this we cannot see from the price trends only. And with that we arrived at the end of this video. Now if you enjoy this data-driven way of analyzing car markets but would like to see an analysis for a different car, head over to my channel. Over there you will find detailed market analysis for a large variety of cars. Can't find the car you're looking for? Let me know down below in the comment section for which car you would like to see an analysis. As always, thank you for watching and I hope to see you next week for a new video.